Hello there and welcome to a very different video here from Digital Foundry. So last week Insomniac Games patched Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart on PlayStation 5, and one of the new features that was added is rather fascinating. You have the ability to switch the game from 60 to 120 Hz on compatible monitors, and when you do that, when you adjust the Fidelity mode, the target frame rate changes from 30 frames per second to 40 frames per second. And the question is, why is Insomniac doing that? What is the benefit to the gamer? And how does it look and how does it play? And to talk to me about it, John Linneman.
Rich, yeah, this is something I really want to talk about because I believe we've discussed this on DF Direct before, and it's kind of a big deal. I think this is something that could be really useful for many other games going forward, targeting higher fidelity visuals at the expense of going for 60 FPS. And today I think we can actually sort of help shine a light on why this is a big deal.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I think first of all we kind of need to explain why games tend to run either at 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second. And essentially it's down to the refresh rate of the screen, right? So 60 frames per second game will refresh, it will produce a new frame with every refresh of the display. 30 frames per second, it'll produce a new frame every 2 refreshes of the display, and this produces a consistent experience.
I mean, that is key to the frame time graph that we show in all of our frame rate analysis videos. If you watch that, 60 frames per second, it takes 16.7 milliseconds for each new frame to be generated. When that target is reached, you get a completely flat line. Same at 30 frames per second, where it would be 33 milliseconds even, right? Mm-hmm. But when you have a frame rate in between then, let's say like 25 milliseconds, which is an important value to select here, on a 60 hertz display, it's not possible to display for that period of time, right? Mm-hmm. So what ends up happening is the display has to essentially display, say, one frame for 16.7 milliseconds, and then the next frame might last for 33 milliseconds, right?
Yeah.
So while that sounds insignificant, you're actually displaying a single frame or each consecutive frame for varying lengths of time. And even though it's a small difference in terms of the actual number, the perceptual difference is that you end up with this sort of screen judder. So you either get judder, or if you opt to disable vertical sync, you end up with tearing as well. Although that's fortunately rather uncommon these days.
Thankfully. So all of this makes what's happening with Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart rather fascinating, because 40 frames per second does divide evenly into 120 hertz. So essentially, rather than updating the screen once every 4 refreshes for 30 frames per second, it updates every 3 refreshes for 40 frames per second. Because you've got 120 hertz, you have more leeway in the types of sort of decimation of frame rate that you can do, and so you can deliver 40 frames per second with even frame persistence. And basically, the effect is rather fascinating. So yeah, why don't you walk us through that?
So as you say then, as I noted before, 16 milliseconds for 60 FPS, 33 for 30 frames per second on a 60 hertz display. Here, at 120 hertz output, each frame persists for 25 milliseconds, right? And essentially that allows this boost of frame rate without impacting the actual fluidity or persistence time of the frame, which means that the result is much smoother motion. And I do kind of want to put this into perspective in the fact that this concept isn't actually like really new by any means. Like if you go back to older DOS games, I think one of the key examples is the original Doom. Internally, that game, it always outputs 35 frames per second, right? The newer source ports use interpolation to give it the appearance of a higher frame rate, but it's a 35 frames per second game. The reason 35 was selected is because that is half the refresh of 70 hertz, which was the output of the monitors that you would get when using DOS Mode X. So you get a slightly higher frame rate by using a higher refresh rate that divides evenly into the refresh rate, and that's exactly what Insomniac is doing here. And because 120 hertz is becoming sort of a new standard this generation, I think it makes a lot of sense for this sort of use case. And well, the result is that even though it's only an extra 10 frames per second, there is a notable boost in overall sort of fluidity to the image.
Yeah.
And the reason that I feel like as your frame rate gets lower and lower, those jumps in performance make more of a difference, right? Like if you're at 20 frames per second and you move up to 30, that is a huge difference. And it's almost the same here when going from 30 to 40. And yeah, when you couple that with the smooth frame persistence you get from 120 hertz, it just means that the game looks a lot smoother in motion.
Yeah.
But I guess the question the audience then would have is, okay, so the game already has a 60 hertz mode for 60 frames per second mode. What good is this? Like, is it really worth it? And I would say it's sort of an interesting use case, right? Because the game already provided options. It's like, here's Fidelity mode if you want to target sort of the 4K pixel counts with some extra detail. It's basically a higher quality output. The performance ray tracing mode, of course, does reduce the resolution significantly, though I still think it looks excellent in motion, and it does get you to 60 FPS. This middle ground effectively allows you to maintain pretty much like 99% of the quality you get roughly in the normal fidelity mode, but at a frame rate that is noticeably smoother. So it's kind of like a averaging out of things. And this is sort of the type of thing that a developer might employ if they wanted to target a higher quality image, but also still deliver a slightly better than 30 FPS experience.
Well, let's explain how we're delivering the footage that we're showing here. So, yeah, I mean, first of all, the frame rate graphs.
That's important, yeah.
Obviously, we've got 30, 40, and 60 frames per second. We're looking at 60 hertz fidelity and performance RT modes. And we've also got capture of the 40 FPS mode, the fidelity mode at 120 hertz. And because we're running them at half speed, you can actually get all of the motion resolution within a 60 hertz container.
And that's key, by the way, of course, because that means that by running it at half, it's 20 frames per second for the 40 FPS mode and 15 for the 30 mode, which is the same as Virtua Racing Mega Drive versus 32X, might I add.
I think the thing to point out, though, is that, you know, looking at the frame rate graph there, you've got 30, 40, and then this big gap to 60, right? But if you look at the frame time graph, then essentially the 40 FPS mode sits exactly between the 30 and 60. It's, you know, basically 25 milliseconds, plays 16.7 at 60 FPS, plays 33.3 at 30 FPS. So the frame rate graph is actually quite misleading here because it's not actually reflecting the way you're going to see and experience the game. That frame time graph there is all important. So yeah, basically it is effectively a midpoint between 30 and 60 frames per second in terms of milliseconds, in terms of render time. And it's only possible with that level consistency on a 120 hertz screen. But yeah, let's look into comparisons here because, well, from your video, John, I know that the difference between fidelity mode and performance RT, first of all, it's resolution. That's beyond doubt. Resolution on performance RT is a lot lower. But there are other features that are pared back to get the game running at 60 frames per second, right?
Yeah, that's right. So they made some tweaks to things like crowd density, specifically in the city areas. And also, like during the intro, they sort of call out some of the crowds in the stands, so it's a little bit more sparse, you know, and a few other tweaks here and there. Plus, the actual resolution of the ray trace reflections is impacted by the fact that the overall resolution is lower. But by and large, I mean, it really just comes down to sort of minor tweaks plus the resolution change, and that gets you to 60 FPS,
right? Which
you know, I think is a fair trade overall. But this is kind of an interesting left turn and alternative to that.
Right, so the fidelity mode, 120 hertz, targets 40 frames per second. The render time available is 25 milliseconds rather than 33. So there is basically a lowering of the render budget. So you'd expect quality to drop. But that doesn't really seem to be the case for most of the time, right? Which suggests that a lot of the time the game is running at native 4K and actually has GPU overhead available. And that's how they've been able to make this kind of intermediate spot between fidelity and performance RT work.
Yeah, and I really think this also sort of highlights, between this and the fact that they have that 60 FPS mode, to me it suggests that they have a lot of CPU time still free, so they're not really bogged down there, which was traditionally sort of a bottleneck in terms of hitting higher frame rates. So by carefully balancing their GPU resources here, there is basically little to no perceptible loss in quality. If there is a difference in resolution between the 30 and 40 mode, it's something that is almost impossible to pick up, I suppose.
In motion,
without
definitely.
Yeah, like when you're actually playing, you're not going to see any real difference here, which is not the case with the 60 FPS mode, where you definitely do notice an actual dip in quality.
Yeah, basically, as render time decreases, so the pressures on the whole system increase. So, basically, it seems that Insomniac have targeted 40 frames per second or 25 millisecond render time here, and it kind of hits the sweet spot for 120 hertz screens, in that essentially you're getting the full fat experience, dare I say it, of the Fidelity mode, but in terms of screen update, in terms of perception of the action, it's a kind of midpoint between 30 and 60 frames per second, and it actually works really, really well. You don't feel as though you're missing anything from the 30 frames per second mode, and that's just absolutely tremendous.
And that's borne out with the numbers on the frame time graph, where it is exactly in between them, basically. So it is a direct midpoint. So even though it seems like it's less than you might expect, the perceptual difference is that, this feels noticeably smoother.
So we can assume that there was maybe some GPU overhead and a lot of CPU overhead left over on the 30 FPS Fidelity mode.
Yeah.
And this 40 frames per second mode, and we've got to stress it only works on 120 hertz screens, actually enables Insomniac to tap into all of the GPU resources, I'd imagine, and a lot more of the CPU. So it's just kind of like a win with no real drawbacks.
There is a caveat that's worth mentioning. So a lot of televisions do actually support 120 hertz output, or input, I guess you could say, but they're not necessarily HDMI 2.1 screens.
Right.
To actually take advantage of the true Fidelity mode at 4K resolution, you do need a 2.1 compliant screen. Anything less, if you enable 120 hertz mode, your TV will be reduced to whatever its maximum 120 hertz resolution is, which is typically 1080p.
The PS5 only supports 1080p 120 output.
That's a good point. I'm thinking of on the Xbox you have a choice, but on PS5 you're right, it goes straight down to 1080p. There's no choice there. So
yeah, and that's why this video is 1080p, because in order to capture the 40 FPS mode at 120 hertz, we had to drop to 1080p 120 output, because there are no HDMI 2.1 capture cards available. So I just want to talk a little bit about the implications here, because going back to another game we looked at a while back, Remedy's Control, it has a ray traced reflection mode, 1440p 30. Okay, and we discovered, or rather somebody on Twitter discovered, that if you engage photo mode, it removes the 30 frames per second cap. And I've got some sample clips here of basically playing the game at 30, engaging the photo mode, unlocking the frame rate, and you'll see that Control basically runs, for the most part, above 40 frames per second when it's fully unlocked. The reason Remedy didn't produce a 40 frames per second mode, I suspect the development time involved would be quite onerous, and it would mean performance testing the whole game. It doesn't use dynamic resolution scaling in the way that Ratchet does. But this is an interesting example of, similar to Ratchet, there is GPU overhead left over in the 30 FPS Fidelity mode, and in theory it could be repurposed to producing a 40 FPS mode. I mean, if you look at these kind of void sections here in Control, unlock the frame rate via photo mode, it's actually running at 60. So there is actually, not every game is going to be fully tapping out the GPU in all scenarios. So this is actually really interesting pioneering work here from Insomniac in getting more out of a 120 hertz screen and opening up more options to the gamer. And the actual gameplay experience, I mean, Insomniac talk about lowered latency. So I decided to put that to the test in the time-honoured fashion of pointing a 240 FPS high-speed camera at my LG CX in game mode with the DualSense controller in view. With each of these tests, I used 10 samples averaged. So as you can see here from the results, 30 FPS, Fidelity mode, 60Hz screen, obviously it's going to be the highest latency, 117.5 milliseconds. Remember, this does include the LG's display latency, which is, pretty much best in class. But here's the thing, 40 frames per second mode with the LG in 120Hz mode. Massive latency saving here, we're all the way down to 80.8 milliseconds. Again, we're measuring button press to animation. I did that 10 times and averaged for this result. Now it's the two 60 FPS modes next, the latency results from that, the input lag there, that is quite fascinating. So in 60Hz mode, with the game in performance RT mode, running at 60 frames per second, again 10 samples, average 75 millisecond lag. Now what's remarkable here is that at 40 frames per second in the Fidelity mode, in 120Hz display mode, it's only 5 milliseconds slower on average than the 60 frames per second mode on a 60Hz screen. And obviously, there does seem to be an advantage in running on a 120Hz screen there, because the 60 frames per second mode, performance RT, claws back, about 14 milliseconds there, just by virtue of running at 120Hz there, which actually surprised me. But again, this is an average over 10 samples. So Ratchet launched with a 120Hz mode, specifically for lower latency. It was patched out, I suspect, because it was causing issues with HDMI 2-point screens locking to 1080p, but it's back. It's now optional, and if you have an HDMI 2.1 display, there's clear advantages in using any of the modes with your display set to 120Hz. And the 40 FPS mode, the Fidelity mode, does seem to give input lag results that are very, very similar to the 60 FPS mode on a 60Hz screen, which I think is remarkable. But basically, I guess the only alternative to the sort of technology we're looking at here, the kind of technique we're looking at here, would essentially be VRR, which doesn't have support at the moment on PlayStation 5. So, John, why should a developer target a 40 FPS mode like this rather than just unlocking the frame rate and leaving it to VRR to do the job?
Well, so I think that's going to vary from case to case, right? And I think these two solutions target different problems. So first of all, VRR on most displays, typically the range is 40 frames per second and up. And some of those ranges get lower, but even still, if you're going between, even with VRR, if the range is between like 30 and 60, those low swings can actually feel rather dramatic, and it's not the most pleasant experience. I know this. I experienced this with some high-end PC games, toying around with it, and it is noticeable. So I kind of feel like if your game is able to stay consistently above 45 frames per second and you have VRR available, then I think that's the best possible solution there. But as an alternative, if the game is designed to target a sort of a higher fidelity, if you're not quite able to reach that 60 frames per second target, the rise of 120Hz screens mean that this suddenly becomes sort of a viable alternative to give people a smoother experience without sacrificing sort of the visual fidelity. Something that could be really useful for like games later in the generation, especially, that might be pushing ray tracing effects really far, or or what about something like, say, Metro Exodus that came out, right? They did a great job hitting 60 frames per second on the consoles, but that came at a significant cost to resolution. I'm not one that thinks resolution is the most important, but if your pixel counts are coming in the 1080p range a little bit too often, it does tend to lead to sort of a blurrier overall image, which is usually a fair trade-off. But having an option for, say, a 40 frames per second mode with a higher resolution is a nice to have. So fundamentally, I actually think that this technique, this is not a platform specific thing. This is something that could be useful for any game on any platform going forward, on any consoles that support 120 hertz. Especially, I might add that something like the Xbox Series S would really benefit from this, right? Because sometimes those 60 FPS modes sacrifice a lot of pixels, and you end up with pretty low resolutions. So I kind of feel like a 40 FPS mode could actually be sort of a big win for that platform. Again, so it just comes down to target, and it's going to vary from game to game, but I think that either way, I think it's very exciting that for the first time in, like, I guess the dawn of game consoles, we finally have a dramatic shift in terms of what's now possible, right? Like this gen, we got VRR on the Xbox, and now we see this 40 FPS mode using 120 hertz output. These are new things that change the way frames are presented and fundamentally could change sort of like the experiences that we get. And it's basically about giving developers extra options to open up to players.
Absolutely. So my last question to you. Now, when Spider-Man Miles Morales first came out, we had a stark choice between a 30 FPS fidelity mode and a performance 60 FPS mode that did not have ray tracing. And it was really difficult to choose between them because you kind of wanted to tap into these next-gen features. So Insomniac came up with the Performance RT mode, and those three features are now part of Ratchet as well. But now with Ratchet we have this fourth option. So my question to you, would you play at 40 FPS with Fidelity mode, or would you still stick to 60 with Performance RT?
It's a tricky one. So
it is, isn't it? I'm struggling with it myself.
The thing with 60 frames per second is typically I find that I usually like to engage black frame insertion on 60 FPS content these days. But with one exception, when a game uses a lot of motion blur, it's actually not that useful. And it just so happens that the motion blur implementation in Insomniac's engine is extremely high quality, and it gives it a very filmic-like appearance. So in that case, black frame insertion doesn't really help, and hitting 60 isn't as big of a deal as it is in some other games. And thus, in this case, I actually think I would be perfectly happy with the 40 FPS mode. But at the same time, I don't know, I feel like I would probably end up going back and forth. I don't think there's a definitive answer. It's one of those things where it kind of depends on the day. You know what I mean? They're both good. They're both significantly better than 30 frames per second. We'll put it that way.
Absolutely. And I think we'll leave it there. But I think the bottom line is that if you are gaming with Ratchet on a 120 hertz screen, specifically HDMI 2.1,
yes,
then you've really got to give this mode a try. And it's quite easy to engage. You simply pop into the options, engage the 120 hertz mode, and then the fidelity mode, rather than targeting 30 frames per second, it will now target 40. And I guarantee that you will feel the difference. Now, the question then is, when you switch to Performance RT, how much of a gain do you get? Do you notice the additional frame rate, or do you notice the drop to resolution and the other sort of cutbacks more? I think it's really fascinating because, you know, that kind of stark divide between 30 and 60, literally, they've bridged the gap. They've found a middle ground with this, and I think that's really exciting.
That's kind of what it feels like. I would always go with 60 over 30, but for the first time I could actually say it's difficult to choose in this case. But then again, you know, I still think we're on an encouraging path in terms of frame rates this generation in general. I don't have the number handy, but I've looked at every game released thus far, and it's like way over like 80% support 60 frames per second or higher, which is so vastly better than what we had the last two generations. I mean, the PlayStation 3 generation was pretty much like the 20 FPS generation. Let's be honest here.
20 to 30.
20 to 30 with torn frames.
Yeah. And yeah, obviously this, you know, it's just been a bit of a revelation this generation. How much of that is down to cross-gen, we don't know. But, you know, you look at titles like Ratchet, you look at titles like Metro Exodus Enhanced. I think that 60 FPS, maybe I'm tempting fate here, but 60 FPS may be here to stay. And if not, this 40 FPS alternative is quite intriguing. But I think we're going to leave it there for now. So thanks for joining me on this one, John. It's quite a complex topic, but we had to kind of share our full thoughts on it.
Yeah, hopefully everyone watching, you have a slightly better idea. If you have any more questions, though, don't hesitate to reach out. I know this can be a little bit confusing in terms of like understanding why you can use it here and not here and why the difference is what it is, but yeah, hopefully this helps.
And if you did like the content, please like, subscribe and share. Ring the bell for instant notifications whenever new videos land on Digital Foundry. Join the DF supporter program. It's awesome. Lots of bonus material there, 120 frames per second downloads, behind the scenes content, You can talk with us on the DF Discord. You can support DF Retro to help make that everything it can be. It's awesome stuff. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, if indeed you did. And just generally thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.